All right, folks, welcome back. We have reached the tentative conclusion. We reached that time again where we're gonna put a feather on the cap. So today is technically the 14th day. We've been talking about playing and interacting with the game, the Corpsmen, right? So around this time, usually when I complete, let's just say, the current state of the game, I find a pretty good spot to stop. So we have completed pretty much all the tasks that are currently available in the Corpsmen, and barring one or two bugs that I will probably retroactively complete. And also, it's in the current state. There more on that later, but I feel there are definitely additional things possibly in the future for this game, considering how well the interaction is between the community and developers. So, what is this segment about? So, generally speaking, as I complete a game, I like to do a retrospection of sorts that doesn't necessarily deal entirely with like what is in the game. So I call these sections. Let's call these sections candid conclusions, right? Candid conclusions. And let's write some stuff. Usually these candid conclusions are, I want to emphasize, they do not do the following, right? They're not supposed to be comprehensive reviews of what's in the game, right? Of what's in the game. It will most definitely contain spoilers if there are any, right? However, it's not a comprehensive review of what's in the game. So we're talking about like number of mechanics, right? Difficulty, maybe things like that, things that are part of the game, part of the experience. That's fair enough. Not comprehensive. I might touch upon the perceived difficulty and stuff, so they do not do that. It is not like this is not an unbiased, I know this is double negative, but it is not an unbiased, like, professional teardown of sorts. Not that really. What it really does, so the do's, is it's an anecdotal reflection. So it's anecdotal. Basically, my personal thoughts. A lot of my personal thoughts. What I feel is the developer's intent. Developer's intent, or this is a deduction, so my deduction of developer's intent. And largely it focuses on perspectives. Perspectives as in like consumer perspectives. Consumers. So we're talking about like expectations, value system, values, pros and cons, if you will, at least from my anecdotal personal thoughts. So that's what these are typically. To me, it's not necessarily for. I'm not gonna say. So, on the do not list, it's not a. It's not for like marketing purposes or anything like that for myself. I'm not suggesting buy this game, buy that game kind of thing. There's no motivation for that. The idea is to um, talk about what the game talk oops talk about the game, what it makes me think of, and things that come up a lot often, right? Anecdotal experiences. So what are those things? Um, Last time with the game Elemental Exiles, it was dealing with the perception of legacy players and casual players with the roguelike deck building genre, right? Like what longtime fans would come to expect, while may not be maybe open to but not exactly receptive to, and then what casual perspective, at least from my anecdotal experience. So this game presents a new thought in mind, and that's the idea that from day one it was fairly obvious. We have two big things. So two big things. We're gonna highlight them in different colors. So we have the green, which we have the roguelike deck builder, right? Roguelike deck builder. And then we have the other blend, the hybrid blend, which is creature collecting. Creature collecting. I might do this in a different organization. So we have these two things, and it comes up time and time again. And I think largely due to how the store page and the theme and the screenshots, like the publicity, the word of mouth often involves these two elements. And what I mean by that is most of the like suggestions, perhaps criticisms, right? These things involve some aspect of these two, at least in my opinion. So it's a great place to explore, at least in my opinion, in this retrospect, to explore where does the corpsmen fall in terms of these two things, right? So largely like we're gonna take it from the perspective of two different things as usual. The casual, so the uninitiated perhaps. So when I'm thinking about the uninitiated, we're thinking about someone who is open to new experiences, right? May not have crystallized, may not have like firm expectations, right? In a sense. So what I mean by that is may not have dogmatic expectations. So like an idea of what to expect from a roguelike deck builder and a creature collector. So still in the exploratory phase, right? And then we have the legacy player, which now we're dealing with two types of legacy. Those who are deck builders and those who enjoy creature collectors, right? And they can also be married together, which to place a point of reference, I think these two types of things can go well. They are able to go well together, and I do enjoy both. I actually have fairly a long history with both of these. So to highlight a few, right? When it comes to deck builders, we have to highlight STS, right? However, I think I feel an even more appropriate one than STS for this situation is I'm gonna say Gordian's Quest. Wait, I get this game's name incorrect a lot of times. It's either Gordon's Quest or Gordian's Quest. Let me make sure. Gordian Quest, right? Gordian Quest would be something a bit more along the theme and kind of like the element rather than creatures, though they're characters, and they're not necessarily semi-permanent. That's where the whole roguelike thing, we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. But deck building, long history, Slay the Spire, Monster Train, Gordian Quest, Griftlands, even more casual forward, like Stack Lands. It's there in the beginning, Stack Lands. I want to throw out some random, like some myriad hybrid games, and then making my appropriate nods to some of the gold standards. But lots of these things have different combinations of deck building, like even simpler ones, like I think it's called, you have even the super indie, like small games. I think one was called like Monster Slayers. We're just gonna toss out some names because it gets a little taxing and disappointing when people describe and overgeneralize people who are interested in deck builders to like Slay the Spire, right? So this game was pretty fun. We had card battlers like Monster Slayers. There are quite a lot. There's so many. In fact, one that I'm very interested in is that I haven't gotten a chance to play yet. Is it's Samurai. Something that deals with samurai. Old. Shogun. Yeah, Shogun Showdown. Kind of reminds me of a play on a Samurai Showdown. It is a deck builder though. So, anyways, here's some references. And in terms of creature collector, I would say Monster Sanctuary. Mentioned that a little bit. Monster Sanctuary. Corpsmen, right? These wear their inspirations on their sleeves for certain. I mean, you can even go into the casual farm sim like things like Slime Rancher. Technically, that involves collecting, but it's a hybrid of a different genre, right? So, deck building, creature collection, and the casual farm sim or the cult simulator, as some people call it nowadays. Those things are incredibly popular around this genre. It's a great place to start for like newly minted indie devs. And then puzzlers, right? Which puzzlers are irrelevant to this discussion right now. So that's kind of where we're headed. And I think my general organization is I want to center the discussion around the perspective of the casual and the legacy player with respect to what is expected of roguelike deck builders and creature collecting. because I think that highlights. So basically we're going to place, we might as well start. I written much smaller than I anticipated. So let's organize this stuff. Before we get there, at the end, so once we, you know, tackle all of this, right, I'll make some remarks regarding I guess my interactions with the developer. I had some interactions with the developer, and my observations, I guess, observations of the developer, because the remaining 2 developers, especially Vong, is very active in their Discord. So you kind of get an idea what the dynamics are when it comes to that, and it's very favorable. I mean, as a spoiler, it's incredibly favorable. So that's kind of a wild card, if you will. That's a very, I want to say it's becoming more of a trend. However, it's executed inconsistently. So in this case, it's incredibly favorable. And then finally, we wrap up with some sort of like personal score, as people do like ratings, right? And then and maybe scores, a deduced score from the perspective, like from the casual and legacy, right? That's kind of how I end it most of the time. So that's the current plan for this session of Candid Conclusions. All right, so let's organize this. I think we're going to touch upon pretty much the center point of a lot of this game, and things that I would like if someone asked me, right? I usually do these retrospective from the perspective, like if someone approaches me and they say, oh, what are your thoughts about this game? And then obviously the follow-up is, would you recommend the game, and etc. And I'll go through most of this stuff. And it goes without saying that we have to make, sorry, there's a disclaimer I have to make here, which is that I was solicited. I can't spell solicited. Solicited unconditionally. So, in other words, I received the game for free. I received a key, right, with basically no instructions whatsoever. I personally might be thinking, yeah, that's great, unconditionally and stuff. It's like, I actually don't mind when people give me instructions. They gave me, like, so there was no focus, right? If they wanted to point out something, I usually ask, like, do you want me to evaluate something or look at something? Because personally, I know this sounds a little bit like an unpopular opinion. However, I like doing tasks that are focused. I'm inherently an unfocused person, or very very unfocused person, so I take in a lot of information and try to sort them out. So I'm largely an observer. However, to do these types of like evaluations and whatnot, one must provide some sort of focus. And oftentimes, when people think being solicited unconditionally, it means it's an unbiased, outside of like not paying for the game, right? Being an unbiased review. I am very transparent that my thoughts and whatnot are biased. I think that's an incredible. It's incredibly admirable. I think it's very respectful that people want to be as unbiased as they can. However, to me, as someone who likes to interact with developers or deduce what the developers want to do and what consumers want in their like product, what they're expecting and how open they are, that all those perspectives are biased. So if you're not taking consideration of the bias of the market and the developer, in my opinion, if you're not taking these into consideration, then it's not as constructive, ironically, or maybe paradoxically, I don't know. The idea is if you choose to make an unbiased review, suggesting that you're unbiased, I think that's a little misleading. The reason why I say that is, do you know what an unbiased review looks like? Well, it looks like a text sheet. So what is an unbiased review? It tells you, quote unquote, objectively what is in the game. So no opinions, no nothing. That's an unbiased review. And I earnestly, there are a lot of them. You can do a lot of them. You go in, you count up all the skins, you count up all the limbs. So I could sit here and tell you, oh, how many cards there are in the game. Maybe how many archetypes there are in the game. How many difficulty levels. How many maps, how many zones. Those are the things that you review that are unbiased. They're objective observations of the game. So inherently, I think the vast majority of reviews that claim to try to have an unbiased review tend to be biased. They're op-eds. They talk about things that, use the word good, bad, disappointing. Those are all biased reviews, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I'm referring to. So I was solicited unconditionally. So they gave me a key and say, hey, check out this game. And I already covered this when the day one coverage. And so I received this key, I'm going to say approximately a week following a greater than 3-year early access. Oh, there, Dane. 3-year early access. Konnichiwa, amigo. Yeah, konnichiwa. So about a week following a 3-year early access. Sorry, not a week before. So this is a week before the 1.0 launch. And that's following a greater than 3-year early access period. And I have noticed that the early access period was a bit of a mixed mixed development. So usually this is the reason why I'm highlighting this is the vast majority, almost 95% of my interactions with early access games. So early access games. Most of those titles are people who had an EA period that are nearly very to overwhelmingly positive. The reason why I mentioned this is because I was solicited unconditionally. So typically I do not have an opportunity nor an encounter with a game in this situation, right? So that might be valuable to understand for whoever, like if the developer is going to watch this or someone's going to watch this. I make it transparent that my perspectives are in fact biased, and the early access experiences I have, I invest in the developer. So the developer, I have lots of early access games that I buy in advance because there was lots of observed behavior that aligns with the developer's communication with their consumers, their early adopters, and back and forth. Right. Case in point, Supergiant Games. I currently purchase pretty much all their games if they enter early access. I look forward to playing Hades too. Generally, early access games, I purchase those games, and I wait to their 1.0 launch, and then I play them. So, and the closest one that I have now is Hades 2. I own Hades 2. I'm not a person who plays something without being solicited. So I wait till the 1.0 launch. I play it then because I believe that the developer's visions or perception of completion is at that point. In this case, that was not the case because I was solicited a week before the launch. And of course, doing my due diligence, I wanted to know how far from the early access, what the early sentiments were like. And there were a lot of mixed bags in this one, right? I talked about it in day one, so no need to repeat that here. Now I want to talk about the post-launch, which saw a lot of rapid patching, as well as possibly an upward trend due to the diligence of the two remaining developers. And possibly, I would say, it seems a very positive thing in the sense that it may encourage the developer to want to expand this game. They're actively taking suggestions, although those suggestions we'll go into now because they largely involve aspects of legacy players who have expectations of the roguelike deck building genre, and even more so the creature collecting genre. What is worn on its sleeve, the Corpsmen, is the idea of building creatures, right? And oftentimes, if that is the direction, there are certainly lots of suggestions that revolve around the whole idea of boosting the creature collecting aspect of this game as opposed to the roguelike deck builder. We'll go into that now because I think possibly the developer might have intended to be more of a roguelike deck builder than a creature collecting. However, it seems like the people that are super interested, who are active in the Discord, consider and are primarily focused on the interest of making this game more of a creature collecting game. So we'll talk about that now. I think that's good. I think we covered most of the things. This is a bias, candid conclusion thing. It's called it's called candid conclusions. my bias kind of perspective, right? I don't want to give anyone the misinterpretation that anything I say is unbiased in any way. It is incredibly biased. That's the whole point of me streaming and sharing my experiences. As much as I want to be objective, I think in this case, it doesn't leave. It would be misleading to suggest anything outside of a text sheet, like, oh, this phone has a 36, I don't know, a 52 megapixel camera or something. That is an unbiased review. It's telling you what's in it. I think 95% of people who keep saying that they're not biased, the reviews, like, I'm sponsored by this, but they don't tell me what to do before I put it out. That's not an unbiased review. It's a biased review with no strings attached, like no influence, but it's still biased. You're saying what's good and what's bad. You can say like, oh, hey, like a keyboard has so many keys, it's using so many switches, and then end there. That's perfectly fine. The reason why I say keyboard is I do watch quite a lot of keyboard things as well, and I think it gets a little bit of a misleading concept when people say I'm sponsored by this, but the sponsor doesn't tell me what to do. It's like, that's okay, provided you don't follow up with saying this is an unbiased review, because it is a biased review, whether the sponsor tells you something or not. It's a little bit of a sticking point. I think that's like a trend that's happening with these types of retrospection. So I want to clarify that my retrospections are biased. It's a disservice to say it's not. Okay, so let's break it up into two things. I think we're gonna use this color to do our two things. So I think a great way to review and to provide some insight into whether you'll like this game or not, or something, is to kind of go over the themes, I guess, the developer's intent, and maybe some of the consumer things. So I like to frame this in the form of, we're gonna have roguelike deck builders, right? Roguelike deck builders, right? Or we'll call it roguelike deck building on the one side, and then a creature collector or creature collecting on the other side. And then we're gonna use things to represent the casual perspective, and the legacy perspective. Right? So oftentimes I think the major theme right now that comes up a lot in terms of the roguelike deck building is that the aspect of a roguelike deck builder, let's just talk about the roguelike prospect first. Roguelikes tend to have, or one of the standards, tend to have less persistence. However, since it's a roguelike, it has less persistence, not no persistence, right? So it's not this. It's not no persistence, right? It's less persistent. What are the roguelike elements in this game? The idea is that you have money. I think they're called vellums or something like that. Velium. I forgot the currency name, but money is the persistence. Money is the persistence, as well as limbs. So this would be a card pool access, and you have so money under money, right? This is limbs are also under money because of Chop Shop. A academy or a card shop. We're gonna call it a card shop, as well as the ability to remove. So these are persistent things. So if you have money, that is the currency for the persistency. So the roguelike art, right? The non-rogue art is the money. That is the persistent thing you have, and to some extent is the limbs. However, the creator's intent, the developer's intent, is that the creatures you make are temporary. And that's what spawns my idea that the intent of the developers are that the creatures are the roguelike component. So the creatures act as vessels. So creatures are vessels of your deck. That means, in my opinion, most of the elements of the game, what causes me to think that the developer's intent is to gravitate towards a roguelike deck building experience as opposed to a creature collector, is largely the emphasis on making most of the mechanics. So most of the mechanics are self-contained in your creatures. So when the creature is lost in combat, the rogue experience is captured. So when your creature is lost, everything's gone. So there's the rogue experience is that everything within your creature is temporary. The non-rogue part, the rogue-like part, is the money and your access to shops. So what happens is when you're more successful, the rogue-like part, as in how to lighten up the rogue experience, is often because you have money. You can build a creature. If you have all the money, if you have like infinite money, you can build the creature right from the start, from the marketplace, right? So your creature will be constantly fine-tuned after each run because you have the persistence, which is money. And this game is incredibly unhinged to the point where your creature is already set in stone if you know what you're looking for because of the roguelike experience. So when you have access to knowledge, which is what roguelike experiences are, you have some sort of knowledge that you know what you're looking for. You can build infinite loops within like the first round or 2 rounds. Like it would be inconsequential for the rest. You don't have. So that's kind of what makes the roguelike experience in this game. Your creatures contain all the mechanics. And when your creature is lost, it is lost to the ether. That is in my opinion, the essence of capturing the roguelike deck building experience. When your session is lost, right? Queue up, slay the spire. When your run is over, everything is gone. Now, think about the run is your creature. When your creature when your creature dies, the run is over for your creature. So that's compartmentalizing the roguelike deck experience. Now, on the side of creature collection, right? On the side of creature collection, there are limbs. And limbs allow you to construct different combinations. I can't spell different. Different combinations of card pools, basically, of card pools. Now, creature collecting does involve a lot of specific things that are not accentuated in this game. So creatures themselves, this is where it ends. So the creature collecting part are the limbs. The limbs represent the card pools. So that in itself highlights that this is a deck builder. And much, much more than creature collection. And I think this is where most of the criticism, the suggestions, and stuff comes from. I think this is where we switch over to the perspectives, right? So let's switch over to like a legacy perspective, right? So what are the things that come up a lot of times that are either here or not? So in terms of the roguelike deck building legacy perspective, I think oftentimes the criticism is depth. The depth is, I'm going to say it's modest. So what is very apparent is that creature limbs, so like creature types, or we're going to say creature limbs, presents archetypes. Right? From a legacy perspective. So if you're a legacy deck builder, this is kind of what you expect. And there are those. You have flight, like wings. There are flight themed archetypes. And claws, there are claw themed archetypes. So you have archetypes like flight, which flight actually, the archetype here is using, it's a chore. I don't know if that makes chore. It's a currency based actually, yeah, all right, we're gonna call it currency based. I think almost all of them are stack based, but let's just say it's a chore. Basically what you're trying to do is you're building flight. That's often why I use this term chore instead. You're building flight in order to create bonus effects, right? And these bonus effects, I think the archetype often is drawing. It feeds into pretty much everything actually. So all you get bonus effects for armor, like blocking, drawing, cycling. All the effects are a chore. It's a currency based thing. So you stay in flight, you create things like that. That's an example. Oh, like for example, you have your claw, which deals with bleed effects, and or multi hits, which makes sense, right? Not that these have to be the way they are. The idea is most of the parts have thematic mechanics that's built into the deck building thing. Like fangs, right? Fangs have bleed consumption, right? Bleed consumption for bonus effects. You have things that would make you think of blocking and feed. So we're not going over to all the mechanics, but what is here from a legacy perspective is there's a modest, I'm gonna say a modest amount, but the criticism often is not enough, not enough, right? And that can be a little bit of a stickler because from a legacy perspective, roguelike deck builders is a very big experimental genre, and what is considered relatively modest may seem a lot actually, and very difficult to balance, right? Or to want to play everything. I think in my opinion, it does cater, the depth often caters to experimentation. So depth, when one of the major criticisms often from legacy perspective is that there isn't enough archetype, or like, so oftentimes in my opinion, I'm not saying all legacy players, but for myself, when someone writes roguelike deck builder, the idea is the time spent is on exploration of mechanics. So this won't be true in the future. However, there isn't a card database, right? This is actually in the works. However, to me, a card database, while it might cater to a bunch of like a significant number of legacy players, I think the card database typically is more a card database, which I bring up every once in a while, is more for the casual perspective. It works in the casual, favorable to the casual. So someone who's uninitiated, and then occasionally on the legacy side of things, those who want to do theory crafting, right? However, in my opinion, if you're one that is a legacy player, the exciting part is you're collectively gathering that knowledge regardless, because you want to experiment. So I think this worked really, really well in my opinion. I love, like, and it was compartmentalized, so if you had wings, you know, all the wing pools, so you can control the pools that you're doing, and you test out all the archetypes yourself. You experiment and you explore and you find out all the upgrade paths, right? So what the major depth of this game is through I'm gonna call them limb development. Limb development, and what is limb development is a pathing, leveling, like a leveling. We're gonna call it like hard leveling path. Now there is some diminished return. However, your base limbs, like the cards you have, is based on use. So after you use a specific card, it has upgrade paths, and those upgrade paths branch. And there's quite a lot of them, and that's where the depth comes from. That's where the exploration comes from. Now, it sounds to the select legacy players, and then definitely the casual player, having a card database of all the things you sorted out and stuff is something that's incredibly convenient, so you don't necessarily have to remember them. However, to me, as someone who played a lot of deck builders and whatnot, it doesn't take a lot of time, and it's actually the fun part of the discovery. Like, oh yeah, I wonder what other leveling paths are there. Okay, let's just retrain. All the like options and stuff, the flexibility is in this place. It's in place in this game deliberately. So having a unhinged way of leveling your cards. You can stall the battles for as long as you want. You can practice a skill, literally practice a skill by toying with your creatures, using up their abilities and they're leveling up and whatnot, and then having a free retrain, like an unlimited no penalty retrain, sort of, because you're kind of tossing away XP. That to me enters a keyword that I tend to have used while playing this game, and that's called a sandbox. So not only did the developer cater towards a roguelike deck builder with a creature collecting aspect theme, not a creature collecting game, but a creature collecting theme. They also catered towards the legacy expectation of a sandbox, like as flexibility in recognizing the power fantasy. So immediately, in my opinion, for someone like myself, from a legacy perspective, the roguelike elements that are persistent is sufficient to create your dream power fantasy over and over again, incredibly quickly. Now, the downside is, one of the major criticisms or suggestions is to have a card database, because largely it caters to individuals who don't want to remember those or do not have enough exposure to keep track of those. Naturally, when I see a card build, right, when you see the first couple cards or first couple things, you're largely going to be like, oh, you know what? I'm looking for this. Yep, I'm going to look for this. I'm going to look for this. Maybe they exist, maybe they don't. The idea is that it's nice to have a card database. Largely, it's not quite necessary, right? So, however, it's still coming. So Vong has expressed that is something being worked on. So regardless, this might be a moot point. What I want to emphasize is that what caters to legacy is experimentation. So archetypes are there. It's a deck builder. It's a roguelike deck builder through and through, in my opinion. And the depth is modest, though. It's modest in the sense that the deck building mechanics are sufficient. Not the biggest depth, but it's sufficient. And for its asking price and whatnot, I think it's sufficient. Middle of the road kind of thing. So this is one of the highlights of the game. If you're thinking about an objective observation, the highlight of this game is that it is a sandbox roguelike deck builder that has minimal persistence. Money is the only persistent thing, in my opinion. It caters to people who know that deck building is the fun part. So the legacy of deck build. You are building decks, using them. They're old, retire your creature or retire your deck and make a new one. That's the experience. It is not legacy in the sense of a creature collector, which we'll move to in a bit. But in this case, if you're a legacy player asking yourself, will this game be fun or like will it be enjoyable? I think if any of these things attract you, then if you're not belonging to another type of deck builder that I'm unaware of, though the game does greatly capture the expectations of roguelike deck building. You build a deck, it's a lot of fun, and then you're like, okay, I can build that. Now I'm gonna reset, right? I'm gonna reset, retire my creature. Let's try a new archetype. Can I make this archetype work? Can I make that archetype work? Oh, hey, there's this thing. I'm curious if you can build around that. And because of money stacking and all that, you can basically unhinge like That's why I mentioned the word sandbox. The creature, your creature, is your sandbox, and you can quite literally upgrade any card if you build a system around it, where you can sit there in one battle and figure out if all your cards are going to work out. Right? It's a sandbox, not which does take away. I have to admit, this does kind of take away from the roguelike deck building experience, which is one of the major criticisms from a legacy player. And that is the perspective of difficulty. And that it means like a metagame, right? Metagame. That's non-existent. Largely non-existent, at least to a legacy player, in my opinion. It's non-existent. So what does that mean? Well, at this point, once you acquired and explored and experimented, you can create an infinite loop within like the first round. Like you create a creature, create an infinite loop, and you've effectively metaed the game. So the idea is that the satisfaction comes from how many ways you as the player can recognize your power fantasy. That is the meta, at least my opinion. Now the difficulty, I'm talking about the meta game of bosses and challenges. Like a boss is unlikely to meta you at any corner. Your boss are glorified punching bags to recognize your power fantasy. So as a legacy player, this is the thought aspect. To me, that's what this game is capturing. It's this strong point. You can't, and the reason why I want to highlight this is, as a person, like if you're a person who have played a lot of deck builders, it is reasonable to say you can't have both. It's difficult to have a game that caters to a sandbox feel in which it recognizes power fantasy, experimentation through power fantasy, to have bosses that have a metagame against you. That's like, who has to, like, you can't have a power fantasy if the boss is crushing you into the ground and deliberately metaing all your builds. That's the opposite of a power fantasy, right? So in this game, if you're one that is a legacy player coming into this game, recognized, in my opinion, appropriately, I would love to accurately portray something like, hey, you like building lots of decks, right? Like, you like experimenting decks. Not which deck is the strongest, is how many ways you can break the game. Because all the decks are the thing that differentiates between the deck's abilities are basically how long it takes to set up. So effectively, the only way you can like rate the power rating of all the power fantasies is how quickly you wipe out the boss, right? And that to me is comparing something that's very strong to something that is strong enough. You don't take, like, I would say, without going into the details of the foundational cards and whatnot, there is an effective, nearly no damage, infinite loop, possibly infinite loop of every single archetype in this game. Or there is a way in which any of the centered archetypes like Fang, Claw, Flight, you can obliterate the game. So in a way, it kind of does reflect the experience of combat. Combat is kind of like a creature collector, like in Pokemon. Like, your Pokemon can be trained to oblivion, so you can one-shot pretty much anything with knowledge, right? It's even less than that in this game, irrelevant of what the boss can do. you can completely obliterate it in one turn. Everything in one turn. There was one time I experimented with something. You can obliterate it by doing 3 actions. Like, what I mean is you click 3 times and the deck will play itself. Dude, it will like forward propagate. It will do a feedback loop that will end the battle because it keeps triggering itself, right? And that doesn't even happen in other, like, even that doesn't happen very often in other deck builders. I was afraid some of those things might break the game. And earlier on, there are some bugs that did break the game due to looping, right? So there are loops in this game too, like automatic loops, which that's kind of what I'm saying. Now here's the thing about the casual side, which because of the sandbox nature of this game, up to this point, I think a lot of times the criticism comes from the casual side of things, and that's like obtuse, you could say obtuse wording, maybe like synergy suggestions. So there are lots of things that work against being a sandbox oriented game, and that's usually in the casual front. Experimentation is a bonus to some extent. So usually casuals involve a smooth, oftentimes like a smooth learning curve, right? A smooth learning curve is some of the expectations. However, in terms of this game, usually the criticism is obtuse wording, permadeath, right? Permadeath is a negative, right? It's a negative. A criticism would be like you can't retreat, right? Can't retreat in hard and hellish, right? These are things that deal with like the casual perspective, in my opinion. And then again, lack of card database, because most things like leveling, XP leveling, and how to leverage like delay of game, right? Delay of game in order to maximize XP, or like mixing like draw, right? Combining micromanaging draw with impetus, which is the energy source. That type of thing requires a learning curve, right? And sure enough, the developer, since the beginning, since I started playing and then up to this moment, the developer has addressed quite a lot of them, which dealt with like reducing it's difficult to try to give up the sandbox nature of this game and the discovery process that works in favor, I think, in favor of the legacy player and at the expense of the casual player. This stuff, what they can do is they reduce the enemies. So they reduce the difficulty of the enemies. So like HP pools, for example, were reduced. Number of enemies were reduced in order to like create a smoother curve to provide more experimentation. And the higher difficulties, hard and hellish, were left untouched because ultimately smoothing out the learning curve is a way to address the casual concern. I think this would be like a major consideration. So if you're someone who's uninitiated, right? If you're vibing with the yellow, where you're saying like, oh, okay, I don't know what I'm getting into. Will I have trouble understanding some of the mechanics, or like how do I maximize mechanics and stuff? This game is a sandbox. So when you walk into a sandbox, you have to get creative and experiment, which is the legacy part. Legacy players, including myself, love that because I know what I'm doing. I have ideas already going into a sandbox. It's kind of like throwing someone onto the beach and ask themselves, go entertain yourself. Well, a person who hasn't ever been to the beach or has no idea, they probably just sit there and say, well, this is kind of boring, right? Is someone gonna tell me some ideas to do, or like tell me what to do? No, it's a sandbox. I chose a beach because a sandbox, right? As a legacy player, you go in, it's like, okay, where's all my cards? Let's go find all the cards. Let's see what kind of sandcastle we can build, right? Oh, let's not even build a sandcastle. Let's go build a sand spaceship. Like, what tools do I got? So you're going out and you're collecting right away because you're already creative in that process. So this game doesn't do that. It is very legacy forward. If you're not necessarily familiar with game mechanics of like deck building and stuff, it can be some growing pains. However, I think Vong and his colleague are doing a fantastic job in trying to work with what they have to reduce the punishment for experimenting. Now, the problem I can see with this is it's a band-aid because this game is a roguelike deck builder. So at some point, the casual person being initiated into a legacy player, if they even get there, will have to sacrifice their progress, quote unquote progress. And the perception of a casual player is that that progress is lost. So when you're building a deck, eventually, in order to build a better deck, you must erase the current deck. You must, release the creature and make a better creature. And that part is kind of difficult to communicate. And I feel that when I'm looking at the Discord channel, right, the same comment is iterated over and over again that this game is a that paraphrased is a roguelike deck builder. You are meant, it is expected that you either voluntarily delete your characters, like, retire them to the pasture, or they die, right? In fact, most of the time I chose when my creatures die, and I chose when to delete them because it's a sandbox game, in my opinion. So this is the perspective that you might want to keep in mind when if you're considering playing this game. It is a lot of fun if you're hopping in and you're saying, how can I bork this game? Like, because that is what it is. It is absolutely incredibly addicting to know that you're gonna make a broken creature that's gonna crush. I mean, the achievements alone already tasks you to do things like a solo run. In fact, I think one of the things that are a little bit obtuse is that if you do a solo creature run, you're more likely to create an infinite loop than having 3 creatures because it's juggling too many things, right? So if you have a specialist build, I'm gonna hats off to like Slay the Spire and stuff. When you think of archetypes and you think of a game like this that allows you to remove at the cost of health, it doesn't matter how much health you have. If you create an infinite loop, you could have 1 HP and you'll still beat the game. Like, with your eyes closed. So the idea is you have limitless removal and grooming. You have no punishment for anything other than you lose your creature and you build another deck immediately. And you have a marketplace that rotates and get restocked based on a currency you can stack unlimitedly, right? That is screaming, you don't have to choose. You can create whatever you want. And sure enough, pretty much anything can be broken in this game. So the first words that came out of my mouth is sandbox and unhinged. Right? That is what I feel that is the epitome of this game. If you are of that mindset and you just want to like thrash this game as hard as possible because your creatures are going to be OP, and then you just want to keep building OP creatures, that's it. And then of course the downside is, the trade-off is there isn't anything that actually challenges you. If you play a sandbox game, think to yourself, how often do you get challenged in a sandbox game? No, it's shenanigans. How absurd things can be. It's not weighted or predicated on, oh, let's design a boss that will shut down all your fun. It's kind of like telling someone to, here's a sandbox with no sand in it. Go at it and have fun. Like, no, throw someone in a box with no tools because the boss or a mean person took away all your tools. That's kind of like where I'm going with this. So for a casual person, I think if you're interested in going in the deep end, as in if you feel like you're someone who's very creative and want a game that gives you enough time to be as creative as possible, then this can work. I earnestly think that most of the design language in this game is catering towards the purple here, the legacy player. If you want if this game goes on sale, it had a pre-launch sale, I'm gonna say for its price, you can probably spend a solid to cover all the archetypes, a solid 20 to 30 hours to basically be able to refine and streamline and or do a massive mammoth deck, like mill type decks, like all those types of decks. You can one shot all like one shot, one turn, OTK every single thing with every single archetype. The satisfaction is understanding how the mechanics interact with each other. Like how, if you have seen those loops, oh, if I do this and this, that creates a perpetually infinite amount of energy. That's the satisfaction of this game. It takes the risk away. So it becomes a sandbox when the risk is removed. Slay the Spire, for example. It feels great when you land on like an infinite loop or a infinite scaling or stacking 1000, but that game comes with a risk. It's the roguelike experience, right? It's the roguelike part. In this game, there is some of that. Your creature can be lost. And in the beginning, at least for a casual player, that seems like it's overwhelming risk. And in turn, the developer has reduced that risk in order for one to recognize and have enough time to realize by the time you get to hard and hellish, it is incredibly rare that you aren't one-shotting everything already, due to experience and understanding, right? Like, I actually deliberately experimented with archetypes that are terrible, and it was largely doable. And it just spent a really long time being able to be successful, like to accomplish the task of defeating your enemies, right? However, even the even a car, like even a deck that 90% of the time you're drawing cards and you had one attack, it was fine. If you had 100 attacks, which I had a team that had 100 attacks, like over 100 attacks, is still fine. Pretty much anything goes in the game. So it's I think a very topical example to highlight this main selling point. I would say it's a main selling point of this game is if you look at Minecraft and you're thinking, oh, I can't wait to build that castle, or oh man, I wonder if it's possible to build like a automated roller coaster cart ride in Minecraft, then this is kind of the deck building perspective of this game. How many things can you build? Your creatures are your decks. How many what kind of combination of creature parts that you have that you can build, and then the creature part is purely cosmetic. And we'll go into that now, because this is the second prong of most of the criticisms and suggestions, and it will be in relation to recognizing that the part that I would say, if you're that type of person that I'm describing here, that likes to experiment and just be OP as heck and be proud of your creature, and then also have the ability to make the creature largely look relatively flexible in how it looks, that is largely my counter argument to lots of the legacy creature collecting enthusiasts. So here's what I'm talking about here. So this game does have a theme. So, right, I already mentioned this already, a theme of creature collection. And that is coming from the concept of limbs. So you build, right? So you build a creature largely with a flexible visuals, and that's where it ends. That's largely where it ends. And you know what's in now? It's the flip side. So now we're doing a role reversal. We'll start with the casual perspective. Now the casual perspective, so they're the uninitiated, right? What determines creature collecting, oftentimes, in my opinion, is the idea of making something you like. Making something you like, and then collecting the rest. So call it more of like an aquarium like thing, right? Let's take a chapter from Game Freak, for example. So to a casual player like myself, I feel like I'm slightly towards the casual creature collector than the legacy hardcore kind of thing. So I would experiment modestly with different types of creatures, right? However, I would functionally rely on a subset of creatures. And then enjoy the act of collecting the rest. So what does that imply? It works to this game's advantage on the casual side of things as a creature collector, because knowing that you can construct all the creatures with the limbs, so the limb collection, right? I think that's what the developer's intent was. You can collect all the limbs. and it serves as a mechanical function for the roguelike deck building. However, the satisfaction comes from collecting the limbs. The satisfaction doesn't necessarily come from the idea that all the creature parts, all the creature limbs, all have unique, what I'm gonna call, let's put this under legacy. I think going a little, I'll be getting to legacy part soon, but creature collecting is more associated with RPG mechanics. As opposed to roguelike. The roguelike mechanics are a paradox against the RPG mechanic. So the word I chose very specifically is the word persistence. Creature collecting games, for the vast majority, when we're talking about the legacy perspective, right? Where it's in the proper color. The most iconic and standardized stuff of creature collecting is like Game Freak, Pokemon. They usually lean heavier on an RPG mechanic than they do roguelike. They're at opposite ends. They're not mutually inclusive of each other. So what are these RPG mechanics? Like, well, creatures are not only collectible. Actually, let's go put it at the end. So, for the casuals, this is kind of what I mean. Let's first think about this. You have your favorites, right? I don't know. Your favorite Pokemon team is going to represent the vast majority of your entertainment. You invest, right? Let's make sure we complete this idea before we draw some contrast. So you're going to invest RPG style into a permanent group. Or maybe like a permanent group and an off group. And the satisfaction comes from collecting the rest, like knowing that you have the rest. So whether they constitute as unique characters, unique creatures, even if they're completely redundant, as in, oh, I like this group because they look great, like they look awesome, and I personally love the way they look, so I want to keep them around. And you collect the rest. If they're redundant, no big deal. If they're completely different, still no big deal, because you have your favorite, right? And occasionally you'll splash in some other peeps and see if you can improve a little bit, right? That is, to me, that is why I say it's casual. It's very casually approached as a creature collector, while favoring a roguelike deck builder. Because in my opinion, the way they design limbs to have basically overlapping card pools, as opposed to having them unique or something, where it forces the person to make a creature choice or a visual choice, is something more of an RPG mechanic expected of a legacy player, not of a casual player. So in my opinion, this game, from my observation, is that this game is most definitely designed in a perspective of a roguelike deck builder before a creature collector. So creature collections often favor RPG mechanics that make the creature collecting unique. So, and because in my opinion it's often associated with RPG mechanics, persistent things are expected, and we're going to go into that now, which is where the legacy, most of the criticisms of this game is coming from the legacy department. So you kind of see the organization, right? On the top, on the top here in that color, I think it's more of the developer's intent, right? These are the things that are in the game. That's the talking topic. And then I started with things that are favorable. So the legacy player that is focused on roguelike deck building will find this game probably fairly entertaining. And then if a creature collector person who's like a casual dabbler will largely find this okay too. Like a lot of the design choices okay, because they're largely focused on exploring the deck building aspect, right? So if you're someone who's like light on creature collecting, like, oh, you just like collecting and doing tasks while also very, very experienced in roguelike deck builders, this is probably you, right? This game can be very attractive. Even the bugs are irrelevant, in my opinion. I had a couple soft locks, couple hard locks on like a looping thing, and all I can do is really laugh about it because the game is broken. Like, what I mean is, if that happens, it's because of an absurd mechanic in the game, like deliberately being absurd. And that's funny in my opinion, because you saw it from a mile away. Like the moment I saw that rabbit, the rabies card, right? I'm like, this can't go well. Like this is gonna break my deck, right? Immediately. And you can only laugh about it. Or like you try to do something that's I don't think that's gonna work, that kind of thing, right? Or you deliberately pick choices that will ruin your deck and destroy it intentionally, and it's funny. Of course that means it comes at the expense of the casual, right? And they're doing some stuff to try to address that. Meanwhile, on the flip side, creature collecting is also having the major point of criticism, because this, in my opinion, these are the two highlighted things that people will get. In my day one video, I still continue to back up what I said about the duality between creature collecting and roguelike deck building. And one of the biggest dualities, as in if you add towards one, it's going to take away from the other. And that's balancing persistence. Persistence is the tough part. So what do I mean by that? The legacy player, like someone who's used to creature collection, right? Expect persistence. So what is that persistence, in my opinion? These are purely anecdotal. Obviously, I'm using some generalizations. I want to make sure that I'm not talking about everyone. Some things to think about, at least. Or maybe you might not be aware of it, perhaps. Persistence. So creatures are permanent, right? When you're playing a creature collector, they're your babies. You want them to live. You also want them to have passives, growth, legacy. Not that other type of legacy, but legacy, right? You want showcase, right? Uniqueness. So why are these criticisms? Because if you think about a legacy perspective of roguelike deck builders, literally the opposite. I'm not like, and I'm using literally as in literally. If you're playing a roguelike deck builder, most things are semi-permanent. Roguelike, most of the things are temporary. And maybe they'll add one or two things that make permanent. Well, the developer's intent is that money is largely the only permanence outside of limb collection. So limb collection and money are the only two permanents in the game. So when you're talking about a creature collecting, and you have someone who says like, oh yeah, I really like that you can create your own creatures, right? And build your own creatures. If they're heavily focused on the idea that is the creatures that are the showstoppers of this game, most of these criticisms are going to come up. Basically, why aren't the limbs, for example, why aren't the limbs all unique? The limbs should have some sort of passive. Why do I have to lose my creatures? It's too brutal. It's too brutal to not be able to retreat. Why does it would be neat to have my creatures level up? And I don't mean by card leveling up. The game does have a leveling system, but the leveling system is the how many card choices you have. It's a roguelike level up. So it's a roguelike mechanic for leveling up, which is leveling up with a choice, right? And it's not viewed that way, in my opinion, from a legacy creature collection. Like, for example, where are my creatures' base stats? And why are those base stats not increasing? That kind of thing. So RPG mechanics. Basically, more and more RPG mechanics. Where are my passives? It would be neat. And one thing that is working towards this game that is often highlighted, that is creature specific, is the creature's personality. Right? Stubbornness, aggressive, and cunning, right? However, it's not enough, right? It's not enough. The creature only gets one personality. Like, what about it? Can the creature evolve? Can it re-specialize? Like, things that create permanence. And then, of course, things that are permanent, if you're a creature collector, that you deal with permanence. So when creatures are not permanent, they're heavily criticized. So like, that's not fair. That's not fair that I clicked on something and my creature died and now I lost like 10 hours of experience, right? When it comes to creature collection, persistence means that those things must be preserved. Oftentimes it's a really big feels bad because they're thinking of the creatures as an extension of the player, not your skills and knowledge. In a roguelike experience, it's the opposite. Or a rogue game and a roguelike game adjacent, your persistence as a player is the reward. When you're thinking about a creature collection game, your creatures, the things that are virtually in the game, are your legacy. So when you lose those creatures, criticisms will be thrown at you for being a creature collector game, right? Like, it's not fair that my Pokemon went into combat and then it fainted and now the creature is dead and I can never get my Pokemon back. I spent like 15 hours on this Pokemon, on this deck, and it's gone. That feels awful. So that's kind of the creature collecting side of things. So here, in my opinion, this is what I think when I've been playing the game and looking at Discord and looking at like the criticism and stuff. You have creature collector critics, right? Legacy creature collecting critics, and then you have casual deck builder, roguelike deck builder criticisms that the developers are quite actively working to address. And it's kind of humorous because if you look at what I mentioned that the developers have focused on, reducing the difficulty of the enemies, making the enemies non-lethal and less risky, kind of addresses both of the concerns, these two concerns here, which is the risk of losing your creatures. So if you reduce the risk of losing your creatures, it becomes less and less of a concern or an exhaustive concern against legacy creature collectors, right? Like if there's low risk, then the point is moot. You don't lose your creatures, there's no risk to losing them, so that's fine. That's a band-aid. And on the casual side of roguelike deck building, they want to understand the deck building aspect. However, your game does not introduce tutorials. It does not say, hey, here's a way to offset a lot of sandbox type of things is to have guiding points. And I think one of the more common guiding points for a sandbox deck builder is to introduce archetypes through example. So like you go to a store, maybe this is not within the scope of, I think, the developer's intent. However, let's say they introduce a new facility, and that facility, for a price, which is your money, you get plenty of that if you're even working like momentarily successful, or maybe you even get free choices or something. Like after a creature dies, you get a free purchase from this store, and this store has pre-built creatures, and those pre-built creatures have the foundations of a specific archetype. That, to me, can offset the casual front. It gives guiding examples and ideas of how to create a foundational creature that works. And that's ultimately introducing the foundations of deck building. Other deck builders choose tutorials, right? Like, oh, don't forget this. Oh, don't forget this. Or remember that this is how this mechanic works, and you have to consider these things. That can work too. In a creature builder, if you're trying to build a creature, maybe like have a shop on the side that has a sort of somewhat leveled up, and it's a tiered level up. So like if you lost a creature that was, I don't know, level 20, the shop will then offer you a level 5 or level 10 with like a specific archetype in mind, maybe even a random gen if you want. And it can be as simple as, in my opinion, a creature where a large majority of the cards are coming from the archetype's limbs, right? And it can create a foundation of showing, hey, here are all the cards that kind of work together already from here, and it's a soft step back. So it can offset the loss, right? The loss of a persistent creature expected of a creature collector. And it can also, in my opinion, offset the concern of obtuse mechanics, or like having no idea what to do. Like, do I need more draw here? Like, I don't know which card I should pick. Like, which upgrade path is good? Like, that kind of thing. And that's kind of an idea that I thought, in the last couple of days, that can offset both of these. The sting of loss of the creature that you invested a lot of time can be offset by a soft step back by offering a replacement creature, but a few steps back. Like if you lose a level 20 creature, you're offered a level 15 creature, or offered a level 10 creature as a money cost, because money is the consistent roguelike mechanic, right? Other games that aren't deck builders, like action adventure games and whatnot, have some sort of a soft step, like a soft block from falling all the way back to the beginning for casuals and for people who like RPG mechanics. Roguelike RPG games are rarer for sure, and usually they're separate things. Like take Hades, for example. Action roguelike genre. Hades' soft block is that there's a story and a narrative that keeps moving forward regardless of how far you get set back. So the idea is you can compartmentalize them, and have something that constantly moves forward as a persistent element. And the thing that you're doing that you want to keep intact is constantly back. And that's kind of what they attempted to do, in my opinion. Given the trouble development and whatnot, there might have not been enough resources, but the idea is you're constantly collecting new limbs. No matter what you do, you want to feel constantly collecting new limbs, right? So one of the criticisms I think that are very appropriate in terms of the creature collecting legacy thing is more limbs. More limbs, please. Can we have like aquatic biome, a desert biome? So that's going to be one of the legacy criticisms, obviously, because if now the looming threat of losing your creatures are not that big a deal, you have your permanent persistent babies, what are you going to have? More limbs, more aquatic, more deserts, more storage space. Like give me an entire Professor Oak preserve. And then for me, in order to do this kind of thing, I think the intersection, and someone already mentioned this, and many people already mentioned this, the persistence to create history and still not like violate your own tendencies to be a roguelike deck builder is a cemetery. Or a history book. What happens now is that while, yes, certainly you're going to lose your creature, or you're going to retire your creature, which I actually, for the vast majority, I let my creatures die or I let my creatures move on and whatnot. I cycled them out because there's not enough space, right? Storage space. But that's the point. Like, the whole idea of having limited storage space is because your creatures are temporary. They are decks. And no matter how many limbs you cycle out and stuff, most of them give you the flexibility of doing the same thing while changing up the creature. So the creature itself may visually present itself differently, which is nice, but it's still a roguelike deck builder. So all those creatures should have accessibility to the same mechanics, right? That is the draw. That's the draw. However, if you're catering to creature collecting, all the limbs have to be different, and all the limbs have to have passives and whatnot, and they have to be persistent. So the preserve has to have like 50 slots, not 6 slots, because that's roguelike deck building. So you have this like duality. An offset that wouldn't hurt either camp is probably a cemetery or a history book. Basically, oh yeah, my creature died, or I retired this creature, this is what it looks like, great. And then on the creature side of things, like, well, at least I know what creatures I used to have, and with the limited space I have, at least I have a record of what my previous creatures are. And ultimately, it can be entirely made of text. It doesn't require any new asset generation to create a cemetery and a history book, because the asset itself can be just placed as a portrait, and then the rest can be text, right? Probably somewhere in the save file as well, right? And that could be added to the preserve, as in like a separate menu on the preserve, right? And it would offset a little bit of the hard feeling of storage space. Creature collecting is hoarding to the max. It's legitimately, this word is meaning hoarding. You need to hoard everything. You need to see everything. I don't, even having a going to the mess hall, right? Going to the mess hall with all the parts you collected, that's a bonus. That's what the creature collecting part is. It's the limbs, right? However, that's sufficient in my opinion for the casual. I'm satisfied that all the limbs are in the mess hall, largely due to the nature that I am a person who focuses on roguelike deck building. So for me, this game was fantastic. Like, I enjoyed it quite a lot. It makes sense, and like, it resonates with me what the developers might be going with. This is all of a deduction. I haven't really talked one-to-one with Vong or anyone. However, the design, in my opinion, is just that. If you're a casual creature collecting, this is fine. It's sufficient because it's largely shallow in terms of its creature collecting. In my opinion, by design, by intent, this game has a shallow creature collecting mechanics. It is thematically a creature collector. Like, you collect limbs thematically. It's not mechanical. As a legacy player, you're expecting creature collecting mechanics. What are they? Creatures have passive stats, RPG elements that make them unique. Those creatures grow. They're largely permanent and or exchangeable. They are not meant to be rotated out, right? So those are the thing, lots of those things. And there are lots of creatures, and you hoard lots of creatures. You don't choose favorites, you get to have all of them. You get a whole collection displayed, legacied. It's not that. At least from the way I played this game, it screams, oh, we just thought it'd be nice to use a theme to represent the roguelike deck building, which is the part where your creature are the decks. The history of the creature is represented in the deck. Oh, your creature has an itch now because you were being a little bit mischievous, you know? Like, your deck represents the history of the creature. However, in my opinion, that's not technically how the standardization or the current trends of creature collecting is. The creature itself persistently and passively have something that represents its growth, its RPG growth. Creature grows, it evolves, it is effectively sentient in its ways. So like, if you create a bird creature, you're expecting it to be faster or something. Somehow there's a theme in which the bird is like, has immunity to ground effects or something like that, right? You have things that represent the creature's passiveness. This is not the game. This game is not a creature collecting game, right? It has nearly zero RPG mechanics, and I didn't even talk about the other RPG mechanics because it's an unpopular opinion. For me, RPG mechanics also involves persistent story development. This game's a roguelike deck builder. The vast majority of roguelike deck builders sideline or take a back seat to the other part of RPG mechanics, the story. Most people don't, in my opinion, gamers do not consider storytelling a mechanic. I personally beg to differ, and I go back to what Supergiant Game does with their games. The storytelling part becomes a thematic mechanic of the game. Naturally, if you are incredibly mechanic forward, you can't progress the story without doing something to trigger the story. So that part is non-existent here. And for creature collectors, story is still a incentive, right? So what I mean is, when you're hopping into, you can walk into Professor Oak's laboratory, right? You're picking your friendship for life, and that friendship will develop as you become the Pokemon master. There is still a backdrop to progression and stuff, and that's as far as it goes. You become a Corpsman, you do the hellish difficulty, you clear all the bosses, and then there's some light flavor text, right? So still secondary in creature collecting. It is a roguelike deck builder. The mythos, the cards, the themes, the lore get suited. the lore, the lore is what creates roguelike deck builders. Like for now. Now hear me out here. The last game I played, Elemental Exiles, uh Daniel tried very hard to make the storytelling, like the lore building, but still added some storytelling as a vignette. I think the closest thing that often blends well with roguelike deck building is vignetting. You have little punctated parts. In Across the Obelisk does a vignette. And Gordon's Quest, a Gordian Quest, is probably the closest I have seen where someone like they try wholeheartedly to create a larger overarching theme with things. And and Griftlands try too with like 3 different type like character based narrative. And if I had to if I had to take a wager, most of that was probably skipped over. The people like when I'm reading like comments about the game and stuff, rarely does it have any like the vast minority would emphasize, oh yeah, this game's roguelike mechanics went well. This roguelike deck building mechanics really brought the story to life. Oftentimes the story is a vignette. It is a lore building. It's a mythos building. So this game used creature collecting, in my opinion, as a vignette, as a thematic thing to bolster roguelike deck building. Your creatures are flavors of the roguelike deck building. Creature collecting is serving the purpose of roguelike deck building, not the other way around, in my opinion, based on how the game plays out. Like, your creatures are temporary because they serve as vessels for decks, right? So that's the thing that they have to negotiate, in my opinion. With this mindset, my opinion, I'm saying my opinion a lot because it's really a deduction. Most of this is a deduction. If you like experimenting, right? So let's use a red here. So if you're in this camp, right, this middle camp. Oh there, Valentine. If you're in this middle camp, someone who clearly has played a lot of deck building, done a lot of deck building, been around lots of genre, you're here to play this game to experiment. Create a creature, it didn't work, get rid of it. Create a new creature. Technically create a new deck, right? You create a new deck. Is it broken? Yes, now I'm bored. Let's go switch to the next broken thing. How many broken ways, how many things can I viably build? Which is how many creatures you can viably build. And your goal is that you're not attached to any of the creatures, really. Maybe you might have a few favorites that you'll go back to, but the idea is you're largely collecting the stuff for mechanics. You're not collecting them for anything else. And then if you're on the bottom here, that is pretty much what I feel that Vong, the developer, has been communicating with. Like, this is the stuff that they're addressing. In my opinion, that's kind of like responsive, like being responsively wonderful at trying to cater to heavy criticisms, right? The alternative, in my opinion, which other developers like to do as well, is they double down. They double down on these things, what makes their game strong. So there are definitely 2 different routes here, and I want to give one last, like the next point I want to make. Hats off to Vong and his colleague. Vong is one of the game leads, and the colleague goes by like a different name. I saw it briefly yesterday, and I don't remember. It's like Plug or something, but I don't know if it corresponds to any of those names. Vong actually corresponds to one of the credits names, so he was under game lead. And you can either be reflexive and try to address the weaknesses in your game, right down here. As in, those are probably what you're going to hear. Like, oh, can we have more limbs, right? Can we have more limbs? Can we have more biomes? Can we have more storage space? And I think Vong and colleague have spent lots of time really quickly responding and trying to address these things. Now the thing is, that doesn't mean that the game is expanding. It's not double downing. And while they're trying to address criticisms, they aren't. That means they don't have time, in my opinion, to double down on what they have that works, right? So the limb stuff, having more limbs, is actually coinciding with what they're trying to do, which they need time to do. If you spend most of your time addressing the weakness, it's difficult to find time to do that unless the game becomes more successful, right? Then they are able to find more resources to do so. On top of that, mechanics won't be expanded if they're spending most of their time rebalancing the mechanics and then addressing concerns of learning curve and whatnot. So that's where the current state of the game is, in my opinion. I think either way, these are two positives. A developer willing to address a lot of the existing concerns, which, in my opinion, a successful developer tends to have a group tends to have a balance of these two. They continue to forge ahead on the things that work really well because they have enough resources, right? They have enough resource and time to forge ahead on things that they do well, and also continue to address things retroactively that are trying to find compromises that is a win, like a win for one group and a slight win for another group, even though they're at opposite ends or contrasting ends. It's like a big win and a slight win, a big win and a slight win when you're doing responsive things. There are many times, I would say, early developers, especially first-time developers, they get, in my opinion, get locked into feedback, like damage control, to the point where the game turns into something that they didn't go out to make. And I had this, coincidentally, I had this conversation with Elemental Exiles, with the developer, the solo dev. Like, it's one thing to try your best to make compromises to your vision. It's another thing to completely derail your intent of your game at the expense of potentially minority voices, right? So what can I say about the things that work? The things that work right now are also have their slight criticisms, as in there's not enough of it. For example, what produces the staying power to their strength of this sandbox unhinged thing? More mechanics. If the game, if there was enough resources due to the popularity of the game, double downing on the sandbox will make it more difficult for casual players to come in and say, oh, I think I know what I'm doing. No, it will take away from that, right? So there's this balancing act where I think the game does really well the way it's intended. However, it is somewhat overshadowed by an early access phase that was a little bit troubling with other things outside of the development, like the design philosophy. Double downing on roguelike deck building by adding more mechanics, more leveling webs, even having web influence, right? Like introducing like a secondary currency something because your cards have too many webs, right? Like if it branches too far, it can become too complicated. But you can also create tokens that can influence the way the card's going to be upgraded or re-rolling or something, right? That introduces depth, but doesn't give away the sandbox appeal. And that is kind of double downing on what I think the strength of this game is, which is already concordant with what's in the game. Money is a resource that you can continuously funnel new features to customizing your decks, aka your creatures, which will continuously increase in its pool of mechanics because you're doubling down on the roguelike deck builder as opposed to doubling down on creature collection. So even with all that said about me saying like a cemetery or history book, that's largely because, in my opinion, creating a cemetery or history book is less resources than generating more limbs or generating a new biome in order to increase more limbs or generating new storage space. That's secondary, in my opinion, largely based on how the game is set already. Re-emphasizing these things, like double downing on creature collection, means that, in my opinion, the game is, and the developers is telling me they're willing to go in that direction. And that involves addressing all of these things down here, right? So the choice is up to the developer. Right now, I feel the kindness, in my opinion, the kindness of a first-time dev or like a first-time independent dev group often comes at one can kind of deduce how early stage the developer is how responsive they are, which is great. You know, they're very responsive, very enthusiastic on like taking feedback and stuff. However, there's got to be also eventually this like experienced veteran approach as well, where you're like, okay, I hear you guys out. You guys don't like this, but listen, the next content patch, you'll understand why we chose this direction, right? And then, or being able to communicate the direction, like, hey, guys, it's on us. We didn't mean for it to be like to give you the feeling of Game Freak's Pokemon or something. It's not that. It's a roguelike deck builder. Your creatures, they're meant to die. So like they're going to die, they're going to rotate, it's gonna happen. And then like the casual things like, okay guys, we're introducing the card database, but that's as far as we go, because the future we're going to introduce more mechanics. It's going to get more and more complicated. The game is lacking a depth that is catering to our vision of a roguelike deck builder. Roguelike deck builders, roguelikes are proliferated by mechanics. The depth of their playability and accolades and reception is by the depth of their mechanics, and constantly addressing and retroactively easing off the complexity is spending time where it's taking away from investing in making it more complicated. The game, a sandbox game, becomes more overwhelming over time because there's too much to do in it, not too little. Of course, it's up to them to backpedal. Like, they could say, oh, no, all right, we're not going for the whole sandbox thing. Like, I could be way off my mark because this is my deduction. I feel like turning this and double downing on the sandbox idea is fantastic because it coincides with the creature stuff, because you want to build more creatures, you want to rotate more creatures. Experimentation is quite literally the theme of this game. You are a corpsman, you experiment with creature parts, you collect creature parts for flavor of their look. However, it's the depth of the mechanics that is the most important thing, right? So all of that kind of coincides. I'm looking forward to which direction I'm gonna go. So before I go to my like last last thing with the like rating a score and stuff, I think one thing I do have to highlight is that while I said that I did not have a direct I don't have lots of direct interactions with Vong and his colleague, which I still do not have the name for. I did manage to submit some bugs with Steam achievements, and I got a response right away. And it was really cool to have that type of direct interaction. I think the population for this game, like the community for this game, is relatively small. However, at the same time, the developer, like especially Vong, really works incredibly hard. So one really big bonus I would say, as a combination for casuals and legacy, right? A win for both casual and legacy is that the developers are incredibly responsive. And for whichever way they decide, incredibly responsive, right? And for whichever way they decide to go, like work towards creature collecting or roguelike deck building, or addressing largely the criticisms as opposed to working on forging ahead with their game, having responsive developers largely means that they are going to be able to constantly try new ideas, right? Like what I mean is they will not be static. They're not gonna remain static about things like, oh well, you'll like it if you don't like it, we're moving on now, that kind of thing. So that's kind of rare in my opinion. Largely from a creative standpoint, it's incredibly rare because developers are creators. So being stuck constantly band-aiding or responding or working on the same thing is very rare because it hinders the it can restrict creative liberties. So that's admirable in my opinion, and they're incredibly responsive. That takes a lot of time. Community outreach and whatnot, and constantly reading things can distract one's vision, right, at the expense. So I appreciate that quite a bit. And the community themselves, there's already a few stable people who are very, very great at kind of indirectly a third-party representation of the game. So I think the game has, in my opinion, right now, have a great foundation for persisting as one of those like persistent games. Like what I mean by that is, cue the Stardew Valley or Terraria of my, like, I don't even know if it's considered my generation. I think it's more of a Gen Z thing, but like the World of Warcrafts, right? Where this is, I'm not saying it's an MMORPG or something. I'm talking about like the persistent, updated game. And we're not talking about live service game, right? Which is another whole different environment. But this has in my opinion, the undertones of an indie game that can become a labor of love. The really downside, in my opinion, right now is I don't know how Vong and his colleague is going to like support themselves, right? It's really tough in my opinion, looking at how frequent feedback comes up and then how many reviews show up on a daily basis and whatnot. I can only imagine disproportionately the devs are investing far more in terms of sustainability than the game is returning, right? At least in my opinion. However, it is a start, and I think it's a I've seen, like, there are games that had rocky starts that have completely dispelled that whole point of no return thing. With that said, though, I totally have witnessed many things in life where you're in so deep you can't return, or you're in too deep, it's time to cut your losses, right? And I think this game feels quite nice. It's a shame that most of the dev group left, right? And I imagine all the artists left. Possibly like the artist and the composer, at least. So generating new assets, right? New assets like more limbs, this type of thing, can be an uphill battle, considering that it demands, in my opinion, another non-lucrative forward investment by the developer. In fact, I got this impression from the way Vong speaks in Discord that they're really happy that they were even able to manage to bring this game to a place that they were comfortable in, calling it 1.0. And I think largely this game had favorable responses and reception since then, since the 1.0. But unfortunately, the early access period was incredibly rocky. That it's difficult, it's an uphill battle. So that's probably a shout out to the developers being incredibly responsive. Right? All right. And then trying to keep track of time. We're going to go to the last, right? The last thing, which is probably the thing that most people like to watch and read about whenever they think about reviews. It's the last 10 or 15 minutes, right? It's that cue your favorite YouTuber, influencer gameplay. Like, here's 5 minutes describing a game they played for like 300 hours, or a game that the average player plays for 1,000 hours. And here's a 5-minute clip of me summarizing my thoughts about it. Actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say something like, this is the rating. So this is the rating concluding thing, right? So I typically give 3 scores most of the time, and 2 of them are deduced and 1's personal, right? And I have to make a disclaimer, right? The disclaimer here is I choose to do things I already or will end up liking. And I'm going to put liking in a quote, because liking to me is not necessarily something that is exclusively fun or enjoyable. It can be fun. It can also be fun and enjoyable, but largely it's for learning and experience. So I turn most things into a learning and experience point of view. So when someone asks me, do I like this game? The answer is yes, I do like this game. And when someone asks me, do you recommend this game or not, right? My last 2 hours was at an attempt to talk about the game based on thoughts that one can consider or my recommendation. So my recommendations are not based on how well I understand myself. My recommendations are based on how well I understand the consumer, the developer, and how they interact. So my last attempt, that last slide, like this slide, right? If you're in the middle somewhere, in a combination, how many of these points, and it's not comprehensive because I don't have time to cover all those things. I highlighted the ones that I think are like constantly showing up in the back of my head when I'm playing this game. If you're in the center and you check all these boxes in the center, how you weigh them, and then you all the stuff that are detractions, measure them too. And all I can say is my recommendation is likely going to be based on these forward thoughts first. So even if I didn't know you as a person like at all, I'll probably ask you, hey, what was the last creature collector game you played? What was the last roguelike deck builder you played? And it would line, and I would try to line this up with all the stuff that I think about. And the question is, you don't have to ask me. If most of the things that seem favorable is listed on here, give the game a try. If they're not, and you're open-minded, give the game a try. If there's too much negatives, avoid the game. But if you're interested, go watch someone play the game and see what happens, right? Those are the type of recommendations that I would give. So, yes, I do like this game. However, I want to make it clear that when I choose to do something, I end up liking it regardless, because it's one thing, it can be fun or enjoyable. However, it's always going to be a learning experience. It's going to be about learning, and it's experience I don't have, right? And that's kind of where the rating comes in. It's going to be disjointed. What I mean is, I'm going to say I like this game. It's a great learning experience. There's a lot of things. Rating a game based on what there is may come off as a little confusing. And I don't want like anyone say like if I knew the developer or I've talked to the developer, I don't want to give the mixed impression that my score is inexplicably not reflective of how much I enjoy the game. It's going to be that way oftentimes, because it's kind of a balance of what is there and what is not there. I didn't talk about any of the objective things. I largely talk about all the prominent subjective things that I can think of. All right. It sounds, if it's confusing and whatnot, it is confusing. That's kind of non-negotiable. So my personal rating. So it usually comes with 3 ratings, right? My personal rating. And then we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to say, yeah. No, we're gonna stick with it. The casual, so the uninitiated. Usually this is how I go about it, and then the legacy, right? So you have the casual, my personal, casual, and legacy. So for myself personally, I would say where the state of the game is, I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. Why a 7 out of 10 when we consider other things that I haven't mentioned is that I'm a story person, so and a lore and mythos person. So shallow story and lore, right? It's non-negotiable. Like, there's no argument here. It's not part of the design, and personally, that would be a fantastic bonus. It leaves me wanting, right? Outside of all the things that I like the game for, right? So story and lore is a pretty big deal to me. Um, depth. I cater closer to the roguelike deck building aspect more than the creature collecting. So death, right? Mechanics. There's quite a lot to like. It's above average. My scale is 5 being the average, right? So it's above average. However, it's not a landslide. So mechanical depth is a concern, right? A mechanical depth. Um uh I'm gonna say this is more like we're gonna say like asset variety. Asset variety requires some TLC. So largely most of this stuff deals with content. So the content length. And some of this stuff might not even be part of the design choice, right? Like I've already mentioned, this is probably not part of the design choice. So these are my personal scores, right? Some things that I would love to see is more asset variety, depth of mechanics, perhaps a semblance of some sort of story or lore progression. Maybe like an exclusive feature set. So right now, it feels like the current feature set is one size fits all. So what I mean by that is, roguelike deck builders tend to feature at least two, I would say, at least two feature types of like tasks. It can be a leaderboard, it could be a daily challenge, it could be a solo run based thing. It's a repurposing or a different way of playing with your core mechanics, right? So those are the things that I would say maybe like a standard that may be somewhat absent, right? Still above average. However, it's quite absent. I think the feature set, the task, like a task thing, the bonus in this would have been a little bit lower, but I think rushing for like a Steam achievement was excellent. It kept me playing, right? I actually would have done this. I would have done this review probably 7 days ago. With now that there's a task, and task or purpose tends to also be connected with perhaps a story or a lore. And I tried to reach the end, accomplish the hellish thing to see the rest of the dialogue because I am very much a sentimental person. So I like that there's a task, whether it's a task the developers gave me, which is like Steam achievements and stuff, or the element of the story writing. So neither of these are very strong, right? And it's a big area, and especially depth and mechanics is a big area too, right? Outside of that though, I had a fantastic time playing what is there, the game what is there, and even considering, right? I think at the time of this review, I think the game is priced. We had to talk about this all the time, so I might as well get this out of the way. As a factor, most people find this like easily one of the more important things, right? At the time, it is 20 USD, right? And I would say 7 is probably a little bit generous, personally. It is probably, if I'm someone who's influenced, so this is a biased review after all. Most reviews are biased, and for me, remember that I was solicited. So that means I did not pay 20. it was discounted at 16 on launch, to 16 or something. I forgot how much. It's like a 15 or 20% discount. I was solicited, so I received this game for free, right? If I were to take into account the $20, which I typically don't, because I would have chosen to pay for it, as in I would pay the devs, and obviously a percent goes to Steam. Steam is a platform I support, so that too. The Steam tax, if devs have to put a Steam tax, I pay for that too, right? I pay dev, Steam, all the above. So if I chose, it still wouldn't factor in. However, we have to note that in $20, in the state of the game it is now, I would say the casual would more subtract 0.5, and the legacy would subtract one point for this, because 20 is a heavy, it's a pretty heavy price for these detractions. If I had to be like incredibly brutal for myself, it's irrelevant since I was solicited. And most of the time when I'm choosing a game that can give me $1 to the hour, that's a plus. And I played this game for 50 hours, so it speaks for itself, right? It's a very generous. I know other people will find this like, oh, but you can't like compare a mechanics game with a story game and stuff. You have to really understand what kind of person I am first. Like if a story game only has a 2-hour story and I talk about it for like 12 hours, that still counts as gameplay time. So it's about the sentimental learning experience. So I'm not quantifying. When I'm saying $1 an hour, I'm including like my learning experience in XP, not like how often I think about the game, how much I can do with the game, like not literally with the game but also figuratively and creatively. Like, does Corpsmen give me an experience that is invaluable, or like my reflection on future? Yes, most of the time it is, and that includes all those hours. So this did not affect the price, would not affect my thing. Here's the thing though, since I was solicited, it's not a game I would have picked up, right? And that's cool. That's actually a plus. So when someone solicits me with a different take, I'm more likely to spend more time. So it ballooned to 50 hours, largely probably because someone solicited me. I tend to work harder and be more interested in things that I'm solicited with than things I choose, because the things I choose, I already like them. I already recommend them. What do I already recommend even before I play them? Hades 2. Go play Hades 2. Supergiant Games. If I play Hades 2 and Supergiant Games disappoint me, that sucks. But it takes a lot to disappoint me. Right? Supergiant Games, I invest in the developers. So whenever I say I choose to do something, I know I'm paying the devs and the Steam. Not necessarily their creation might not hit, or it can hit and miss. However, the legacy is I want to invest in people. So being solicited, there's a lot of trust involved. You might be thinking, oh yeah, but they're just picking whoever that's low-hanging fruit and stuff. It's like, well, thank you. I'm a low-hanging fruit. That's awesome, right? So I don't typically have these, so I take them very seriously. It's kind of the whole humble beginnings kind of things. Yeah, you could become a big deal and you could forget what it means to suddenly have someone randomly email you and like, wait, we actually know what you did the last 2 weeks. It's like, really? And they didn't say anything. So in this case, I don't know who sent the email, but it could be Vong. and all they had to do was mention, "Oh, hey, we saw you play Elemental Exiles." And I'm like, "Wow, that's cool. You actually saw me do something." And that's more than 99% of video comments on YouTube, where when they make a comment and it's pretty clear that they didn't watch anything. They saw the thumbnail and then they made a comment. So hats off, right? Hats off to anyone who solicits me. I double down on that kind of thing. And if I know that I'm not interested, which can happen, right? And when I'm not interested or I'm uncomfortable, like for example, if someone sent me something that was clearly in conflict of interest with myself, I have the professional restraint and discipline to directly tell them, sorry, I'm not interested. Like, please. And I would even probably explain why I'm not interested. Like, for example, if someone comes up to me and say, hey, would you like to uh, have, would you like to try our product for sponsorship? And also, can you like focus on tearing down our opponents, because our product does better than this opponent's, and I want you to focus on how our product overshadows this other product. The answer is no. Like, anti-competitive, like centered philosophy is a no. So I'll give you an example. Like that's an example of something that I will politely and professionally, in any way, like not even professional, in an ethical and moral way, I would refuse. So this is unconditional. So I was solicited unconditionally. Again, I want to emphasize that. The last three things were solicited unconditionally. Okay. So anyways, for the casual, so here's the thing. I didn't address one thing about the casual. So when you're taking a casual, oftentimes there's less of a tolerance for bugs, right? When you're uninitiated, the first impression is very important. And there are a few hiccups here and there. Weighing, right? It's a mixed bag. If anything is a indicator, when taking into consideration the casual and the legacy, it goes back to my day one, where I feel creature collecting and roguelike deck building clashes a lot of times. So what I was excited to see or look forward to when I was playing the Corpsmen was, how do they get both of these things in their game without directly clashing with each other? And to my kind of apprehension, they didn't, in my opinion. The design was to backseat creature collecting, like I suggested, in my opinion, and then push forth roguelike deck building. Like, whether it was intended on concept or not, it's most definitely like 80 to 90% of roguelike deck builder and 10% a creature collector, and that's by theme. And I already talked about like the lack of a shallow story and shallow lore does not bolster the creature collecting. It actually demonstrates that the priority is roguelike deck building, right? Task-based things are kind of RPG-esque, so like having daily challenges, daily quest, that kind of thing. Those are RPG mechanics that are very reflexive and cater a lot more to creature collecting than it is to roguelike deck building. Roguelike deck building is largely supported and built on the depth of its mechanics and its asset variations, its mechanical variations, relics, permutations on, bonuses, adding new metagame, that kind of thing. That's usually that other set. So balancing the two, I was very interested in seeing how they did it. However, the reality was, the reason why 7 out of 10 is it's a 7 out of 10 roguelike deck builder. I think the 3 points is largely due to either the deviation to try to make it into a creature collector or introduce some sort of creature collecting aspect. and that type is very shallow, right? The stuff that I'm highlighting here are things that I was kind of expecting to. I was wondering where they're going with it. Like, how do they juggle this? And ultimately, if I had to be very honest about this, they didn't. It was used as a backdrop for roguelike deck building. So, not disappointed in a say. It's just I didn't learn. It would be interesting if there was like, I was excited because maybe there's some clever way of doing it, which turned out more or less a above average roguelike deck builder, right? And the sandbox thing is great. I want to. I haven't played like a sandboxy, unhinged sandboxy deck builder in a while. I think the vast majority of deck builders are built around metagame. They tend to be metagame oriented, and a boss encountered lore related, task related type of games. So your incentive to try to do different builds, but your builds require a purpose, an objective, and this is not one of them. It's a sandbox game because largely everything you fight is a punching bag to show how much harder you can punch. So it almost feels like it could be an MMORPG where you beat a boss, the next time how do you get more game time? You show how much better you can crush the boss. It's almost like a speedrun thing, right? In fact, in a different world, dispensing with a creature collection and investing in a speedrunning thing with daily challenges might be actually a pretty solid way. I think that's the route a large majority of indie deck builders who land on a successful core mechanic, like for example, with a lack of a better pun, the next game that I'm looking forward to play is Cobalt Core, and the core of that game turned into something of that nature, where now it's about the challenges, the daily challenges, and building more challenges for the core foundations of that game, as opposed to constantly needing to still focus on generating up your mechanics and stuff in order to support a roguelike deck building thing, and then having tasks to support it, right? So from a casual perspective, I would say this game is at 20, so we're taking $20 is fairly steep, so minus 0.5. However, I would say the direction of Vong's approach, where they're constantly trying to make it more casual forward, like adjusting the smooth learning curve, adding more corrections, and possibly adding more of like a, maybe considering, I don't know the future of this, but it feels like the direction is going towards more of a casual approach. In the state it currently is, I think the casual is more, there are more criticisms from a casual perspective than from a legacy perspective in terms of roguelike deck building. However, in a creature collection thing, it's pretty soft. However, the problem is you get less points. So for casual, you get less points for creature collection because it's a backseat thing. So you get less points from that, and you get detractions, negative detractions from the roguelike aspect. However, due to recent patches, it's improved, right? Not necessarily the understanding of the roguelike things, but it allows a smoother learning curve to allow experimentation. I would say, in terms of the casual, it's a 6 out of 10. It's slightly below mine. I think it's an above average experience in the beginning, due to like recent patches to soften the punishment, and then there's a lot to explore. There's sufficient things to explore while being there's
enough things to explore to understand roguelike deck building without feeling punished for it. However, there's only a, I'm going to say, a bottom line thing for the creature collecting part. So, I think what favors the casual is having more limbs, more biomes and stuff. So it becomes more of a, oh yeah, let's just, okay, today I feel like doing this, today I feel like doing that. More options. Not a casual perspective wouldn't want to have comprehensive knowledge. They're not going to necessarily, is to alleviate the tedium. So alleviate things from feeling the same ish, because the nuance is not necessarily important for this. So 6 out of 10 because there's more working against less points being able to achieve, right? The creature collecting is a bit weak, which I honestly caters a lot more to the casual in this case. And then the roguelike is still relatively obtuse, because if you're coming into it not knowing, like, is drawing important, or how do I create, how do I get more energy, is there anything that creates counters, what does threaten actually, how does threaten actually work, that kind of thing. It's on the lower side. I still think it's above average, because it's very soft. Into the difficulty, quote unquote, difficulty would be perceived as approachable for a casual. Someone who has like no experience or like fairly low experience and want to explore something, above average. It's a soft landing enough to get all the bells and whistles to continue, right? It's not the same as like drop a casual into a FromSoft game and expect them like, oh yeah, FromSoft has 0 tutorials and whatnot. Like, even FromSoft has some lean and whatnot, but it would be below average, right, for a casual. Then, however, I'm not saying that just because it's 6 out of 10, there are 6 out of 10 people who are probably going to play the game and kind of enjoy it, right, as a casual. That's a lot of people. Not 6 out of 10 is above average. So then we go into legacy, and I think legacy is slightly above too. At the no, actually, that's tough. I think it's still going to be a 6 out of 10 for legacy. So the downside here is what works, not enough. And then that summarizes pretty much both ends. If you have a roguelike deck builder legacy player, mechanics, right? Mechanics. More archetypes. More branches. Not more story though. Like no like story, all the other stuff. This is a roguelike deck builder. Those are optional, right? The idea is that there is, in my opinion, a baseline expectation of specific mechanics, and that's where most of the criticisms are going to come from. Like, oh wait, where are my relic systems? Or the creatures should have a, like, it's great that there's a personality situation, but is there a second tier of personality situation? Is there more card pool manipulation? That kind of thing, right? At the price, largely the reason why is it would be a 7 out of 10, but at the price, it's a big detractor. Legacy tends to favor content, and their content is very specialized, in my opinion. And we're not talking about so this score I'm giving is that 6 out of 10 will still be satisfied with it. Like, it would be sufficient. However, the other four, I'm not saying all legacy players are going to be upset with the price or feel like there's not enough content. I'm saying it's still above average, but the large majority of people that they will be contending with or seeing criticism is that the baseline mechanics introduced by other deck builders, like conservatively, have a larger depth than this. So I think the vast majority of concerns from people who know what they're getting into and whatnot would be that their suggestion is, hey, can we have a mechanic like this? Can we have a mechanic like that? Are you going to introduce something like this and that? Not so much concern with the quality per se of like the existing mechanics. Like, oh yeah, okay, these things are pretty cool. I like these things work. That's awesome. No problems there. Now, can we have more? Right? And then it's a double whammy because on the side of the creature collector, right? The creature collector, this is going to be a incredibly negative point, because that involves asset generations. So is that going to be in the future or not? Asset generation, another zone, right? More limbs. And how are our RPG mechanics coming along? Like, can we feed our creatures to make it more individual? Can we organize our staple? Like there are a lot of things that are also the baseline expectations of creature collectors. Interestingly enough, though, introducing a card bank is probably going to be a nice step in absolving this, because the card bank would organize what type of creature parts at least correspond to certain things. So you're technically getting this feeling like, oh, I've collected all these parts. Here are all the cards I have access to in my book and whatnot. So as you can see, I think this is, in my opinion, a fairly fair score. If we were to average them together, it's around a 7. I think it's probably like a lower 7, like anywhere between 6.5 and 7 overall. In terms of, like, if I had to say, if it continues on the pace that it is, like keeping this, I think that mixed Steam review will go to like to the whatever, like the midpoint, or the mostly, or, no, not mostly, I forgot what it is, but between like 60s and 70s is probably where it is right now. I think right now it seems like casuals, it's a bit casual focused, like to create more establishments or like a community, right? A lot of the feedback, quite a lot of the feedback though, is gearing towards legacy feedback. So what I mean by this is, when I'm reading the Discord and stuff, a lot of the times it's feeding into these concerns. However, many of the changes that are being pushed really quickly are changes that address this situation. So if we were to go back and look at this, most of the things on the bottom are being addressed, but largely end up concerning new players. And that, to me, is a very reasonable approach, right? If you don't have a player base, if you don't have a community base, the uninitiated are more likely to take a chance on a game that has no legacy yet, like not a established community, more likely to find new fans than trying to cater to a legacy approach. And to me, if I don't know the developer's background, there wasn't like any information anywhere. A lot of times I really enjoy developers who are open enough to share a bit of their background in order to like give some precedence. For me personally, I think most people, the average consumer, do not care about that stuff. Like they would not invest in something. For me though, as a personal take, I like hearing their background because I can't make any deductions on what their experience is. For me, it sounds like from the development of this game, how this game is presented, they are not necessarily veteran developers in this specific genre. So the game can get a lot of leeway, in my opinion, for saying like, oh, okay, it's not the most polished thing. It didn't create a bottom line that hit all the bottom lines. That's perfectly all right, in my opinion. And that it is incredibly appropriate that one would favor addressing things that will largely address casual stuff, like getting more people to play your game, as opposed to the opposite, which is to double down on principles. So make it more, like, okay, we know what we're doing. We're absolutely certain we know what we're doing. We're following through with it. So despite, I guess it's an attitude or a mindset. The idea is like, no, don't worry about it. I know this game's a little hard now, right? But listen, we're going to keep adding more content. It's going to make it worthwhile because that early difficulty spike is to be necessary for you to understand our late game mechanics and whatnot. That kind of thing can be more representative of people who are more experienced in understand like they meet the standards instead of trying to break the mold, right? Sometimes is not always the case. Since I don't know the developer's background, they might be veterans who want to change things up, or people who are very experienced who want to change things up. Case in point, the last game I played, that developer deliberately wanted to stray away from the standard, and it was communicated very immediately. This game, not so much. I think it's very safe. So what I mean is the roguelike deck building component, it's it's there. However, it doesn't indicate to me that it was like some ambitious, incredibly well orchestrated, like, oh, we already know what we're going for. Here it is, unapologetic. I felt there's a lot of like different ideas floating around in this game, and it kind of did a couple things, and there were clear things that didn't quite make it, maybe due to development costs or situation, and then there are things that work really well, however did not get time to cook, which is probably the usual comment that's being made about this game. The foundations are solid. The game has great foundations for a roguelike deck builder. I think the foundations for a creature collector it's topical. It's very flavor. It's a flavor thing. It would require, in my opinion, to separate them, a writer, an asset generator, like a dedicated artist, a dedicated writer, in order to bring the creature collection to life without like destroying, right? Destroying the deck builder, the roguelike deck building focus, right? It's at odds with each other. At the moment, the way it's designed, it's at odds with each other. If you continue to introduce more limbs, it will constantly highlight how underdeveloped the limb collection is compared to the roguelike deck building. One way to elevate that is to continue to generate new assets, however, retroactively adding more mechanics to existing limbs, right? So those limbs then become more dynamic in their choices. And that means double downing, right? You need to double down on that kind of thing, and I don't know where they're going with that. There's no like strong indicator that there will be future expansion for this game in its current state, because it's largely trying to address the current criticisms at the time. So the developers are very kind. They are very focused on addressing what doesn't work at the moment. And not necessarily generating any like promises or hints or collections for future things. Like even developers, like recent games I played, they would be like, "Hey, here's a poll. What do you guys think should be the next thing we add?" That's not the type of necessary discussion that is happening directly from the developer. As much as there's a suggestion blog with all the suggestions, those are suggestions. A strong indicator or confidence from the developer in saying, "Hey, we got something down the pipeline," that's a different story. So right now the direction is quite clear. And that's a wrap for this game's review. Wanted to keep it within 3 hours. Very nice. 4 minutes to spare. There is a chance I'll revisit this game. If there's a new content that's involved, like announced, I tend to revisit after a major content update. So any of my previous games, I suppose, any major content update, I tend to revisit the game after my review. So for now, this is where it's at. I still haven't heard of bug confirmation from the last 2 bugs. That's okay. We're gonna put a feather in our cap on this one. We're moving on to the next one. Well, maybe the next one. I haven't decided. October is rolling around, so this particular slot is gonna be occupied by artwork, because Inktober is coming up. So I'll be doing artwork for them. I don't know if I can squeeze in the game. We have like 7 days left. I'll think about it. There you have it. That's the Corpsmen. Currently available on Steam, right? Yeah. That's pretty much what I needed to say. Alright. Thank you for listening and hanging out. If you're gonna watch this later, thank you. And get you guys on the next game.